Thank you all for registering for our sold-out webinar on medical practices. Is it time to review your trading entity with Kelly Chard and Sarah Bartholomeusz? You'd be disappointed if I didn't start any webinar without a disclaimer. As a lawyer, I'm obliged to. It's just one of those things. This presentation is for general guidance only, and professional advice should be taken in relation to specific issues. And I know I say that every time, but the reality is it's true. And in fact, in chatting to Kelly before the webinar, we just realized that there are so many things that it depends on. And I know lawyers always say it depends, and maybe accountants say it too, but there's so many circumstances that professional advisors have to take into account when they're giving you advice that this really is a learning opportunity to know about the different options. And then when you're speaking to a professional advisor in future, you do feel slightly better armed than you might now. So nothing's permanent. I thought I'd start on this slide just to say that just because your practice runs in a certain way now, it doesn't mean that it always has to be that way. And it doesn't mean that it's not the best way for your practice to be structured, for your practice to be running in, but it also doesn't mean that it is. Things change. There's been a lot that's changed in the last 2 months here in the world. So that is a sign of that, I think, and don't be afraid to change. You know, there are good things that come out of change. So who's this session for? It's for any leader of a medical practice who wants to understand. And when I say leader, I thought practice managers might be here. We might have allied health practice managers or practice owners, as well as doctors, surgeons, dentists, all the full range of medical practitioners. So what we're going to run through is the structures that increase and decrease your legal risk and why, the importance of structures in tax efficiency, so knowing what sort of taxes are out there and that affect medical practices, and also how to make it the most efficient structure for the way that you're running your business, and how to identify when your structure might need changing. So over to you, Kel. Please introduce us.
Must be me. I can see my face very big there. So thanks, as Sarah said, thanks to everybody for attending this webinar. I'm really pleased to be collaborating with Sarah. We've known each other for a couple of years now, and I think we spoke about doing this particular session in February last year when we were actually at a medical conference in Japan, and yes. We both have been very busy with business and clients and things like that, so it's great that we've finally got around to doing it. So I am, as I said, Kelly Chard. I'm the founder of my firm, which is GrowthMD. We deal with medical and dental practices and practitioners only. So we live and breathe business and finance for health practices in Australia every single day. We're really passionate about providing some pretty straightforward and simple advice to our clients, making sure systems and procedures are set up to streamline and make life easy for you, and just helping you understand, those tricky tax concepts that apply to your health business. So I've been a chartered accountant in practice for 18 years. But GrowthMD's only been around for a couple of years. But over that time, we've amassed quite a few clients in lots of various locations. So from Tassie all the way up the East Coast, and we've got clients now in every state, which I'm really excited. That only happened as of last week that we could tick off every state. So so that's really great. And lots of different specialty areas as well. Lots of general practice. We also have dental practices and a range of specialties as well. Oh, sorry, you're controlling the screen. I was trying to tap it, Sarah. So last year was a great year for us. I received an award as Innovator of the Year at the Australian Women in Finance Awards, and that was for the work that we had been doing with medical practices in innovation and revamping systems and the way that their business operated. my firm, GrowthMD, was listed as one of the top 10 innovative accounting firms in the same year. So that was really great for me and my whole wider team. Our clients are really happy with what we're doing. So we do a customer feedback every quarter, and our feedback has been world class. So we're very proud of that, because that means we're doing what you want us to do for you. We are very busy people, but we are taking on some new clients from 1 July. So we tend to have a client intake 1st of July 2020 for the new financial year, and we will be taking on clients over the next few weeks to get up and running 1 July 2020. So that's a bit of a snapshot about myself and GrowthMD. I'm going to pass back to Sarah so she can do a similar thing.
All right. So my interest in medical, I'm a lawyer. I work with doctors, and I come from a medical family. So it's a discipline, a professional group of people I really very deeply care about. I've got a GP in my immediate family, 3 orthopedic surgeons as uncles and cousins, a general surgeon, one of my cousins, nurse, physio, one of my uncles is a physio, and my cousin Gabby just graduated. She's a registrar at the moment, wanting to go into pediatrics, which is pretty special. In 2015, I won the Telstra Business Women's Award for Startup for my firm, Ulegal. I've published 3 books on governance, including Growing a Medical Practice from Frustration to a High Performance Business. And last year, I launched a podcast which Kelly has been a guest on. So if you want to catch up on that, it's called Accountants on Purpose. And in season 1, I've interviewed accountants that work with medical practitioners. So it's really fun to hear their stories. Kelly and I were at a medical conference in Brisbane, actually, when I interviewed her. So we've got to work out these times when we can see each other in person. It's not looking like that good for this year, unfortunately. So I have worked with hundreds of doctors over the past few years, and with Ulegal, we only work with clients that have a purpose that's higher than profit. So we see medical fitting into that so perfectly, because you do what you do to help people, and in helping people that are helping people, we feel like there's a ripple effect. And as lawyers, it can be hard to feel like you're doing good in the world, but when we work with doctors, we always feel like that. And so that's a special reason why we love working with doctors as well. So discovering the structures, what you're here for. There's quite a few different structures that medical practices can structure themselves as. There's different legal entities, and I'll go through them one at a time just to explain them in a little bit more detail. If you're just starting out as a GP contractor, or even as a new surgeon, you might just run your practice as yourself with an ABN. That's a common structure that we see. A company is another one, just a proprietary limited company usually. A practice might run as a unit trust or a hybrid trust, which is two different types of trust within one trust, or you might operate as a partnership. So what does that look like when you're signing an agreement? I thought it might be helpful to see that. Dr. Joe blogs, just as a sole practitioner with your ABN, your medical practice proprietary limited is a company structure. Your medical practice trading as your medical practice unit trust, and a unit trust can have either an individual person or a company as a trustee. Your medical practice person or company trading as your medical practice trust might be how a hybrid trust looks. And your name and other people's names trading as your medical practice might be how a partnership looks on an agreement. So what are the risks of these different structures? There we go. So if you're trading just as yourself, there are risks because you're not separate from the business. You are operating the business, and everything you do is also a risk. So if you were, for example, if you were to get a medical negligence claim against you, yes, if you have insurance, which you hopefully do, it will protect you. But what if that claim is more than what your insurance will pay out, then there might be some shortfall. And in that case, you personally become responsible for that. So if your family home is in your personal name, that could be at risk. So running your practice as yourself is probably pretty low on my list of how you should be running your practice. The second one that's probably at the bottom as well, which I will skip to as it's bottom on this list, is a partnership. And we see partnerships for medical practices structured in a couple of ways. They can either be you personally, with your partners personally, and we do see that, or we see people with their service entity, which could just be a company, in partnership with other companies. And the reason that that is second to bottom on my list of acceptable structures from a legal risk perspective is that if you have a partner that for some reason has some trouble come upon them and they become responsible for either an insurance claim, or they've done something that they shouldn't have with Medicare billing, for example, you are personally responsible, equal with them, to pay that debt, which might not seem fair, and is probably a good reason to avoid that structure from a legal risk perspective. Next, I think a company is a good structure for running a practice, depending on a whole lot of things, which I'm sure Kelly will go into. But a company from a risk perspective point of view is a much better choice than either you or a partnership. And the reason for that is it's a separate legal entity. So what you do when you incorporate a company is you create a whole new person in your family, is how I think of it. And people sometimes worry about the costs of setting up additional entities, but the risk protection is incredibly valuable. Someone's asking a question. Well, that's a good question as well, Gurdeep. We will come back to that. But having it in a separate legal entity is an excellent idea. So a company then is a good choice, proprietary limited company, which you can use different classes of shares in if you need to, will protect you and mean that if you're in business with others, that legal entity is hived off and dealt with as a separate issue than yourself personally. So then I'll talk quickly about the trust. So trust is then another layer of protection in relation to legal, and what we usually suggest is that you have a company as a trustee rather than yourself personally. If you have a self-managed super fund, you might also have a company as trustee for your self-managed super fund rather than having you and your partner as the trustees. And it's just another layer of protection, and also makes succession a lot easier. So if something happens with one of the partners and they're a trustee, then that can complicate things. So both Kelly and I like to keep things as simple as possible moving forward. So that's probably why a company rather than yourself or you and your other business partners, or you and your husband or wife or partner, can keep things more simple. So here's a good question, and the answer, Gurdeep, might be it depends. But you've got 3 medical centres. Should you have 3 companies or 1? And my answer to that is it does depend. So we've got some clients that do put their different centres in different entities because they're in different states. So there's different tax laws that apply with respect to payroll tax in different states. So it's definitely worth having a conversation with your accountant about whether or not they should be in 3 companies or 1. If they're currently in 1 and you move to 3, there might be some costs for changing as well. So all of those things would be taken into account before any changes were made. It's good to talk to somebody before you incorporate, or before you buy or start a new practice, to get proper structuring advice at that point?
I always, I get asked this question a lot actually, and I always prefer to have separate entities for separate practices, if not for any other reason than for the reason that it keeps things segregated and
the risk then is stuck with that particular entity. But what happens with staffing, for example? Could Gurdeep with 3 practices with 3 companies have one practice manager? And then would you have a service fees maybe that were paid between the other companies to make it more fair from a profit perspective?
Yeah, so I mean there is some issues like that have to be covered off. We do have practices with common ownership, but they're different entities, and quite often there is some cross charges that go across for labour hire essentially and sharing of staff. Some of the practicalities around having multiple practices in one entity come in when you're looking at accounting, so just statistical accounting. So having reporting, you know, I've seen clients that have up to 10 practices in one Xero or mild file, and trying to then segregate that data out to monitor performance of one practice can be very difficult.
Yes.
Selling practices.
Yes.
So when you're trying to go through a due diligence process, and buyers want to look at your figures, and you've got, you know, costs shared and muddled up together in one accounting report, can be quite difficult. So if you are going to run multiple practices in an entity, you have to be really, really strict and clean about keeping good records for each, and keeping expenditure allocated, is my tip. But, and the risk thing, I think, is really important as well. As you said, you know, one practice has a really bad event, the other 2 practices are at risk.
Yeah, we have a client that they're based in Brisbane, and they're setting up in New South Wales and have set up a separate entity for that reason. They don't know how it's going to go. They don't want their profitable practice to suffer if the one in New South Wales just doesn't go the way that they want it to. So keeping that separate from that risk perspective too is really sensible.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. Got to click. There we go. Oh, over to you, Jill.
Over to me. Okay. So when you're looking at structures, obviously there is a whole host of things to consider. So you're thinking about asset protection, just logistically how things are going to work. Most people get very fixated on the tax side of things. So what is the best structure for me tax-wise? And I would never advise anybody to go into a structure purely for a tax reason, because there is just so many factors. And like Sarah says, there's no cookie cutter approach. Everything really depends on your personal circumstances. I guess where I do see tax as so important is when people don't plan for the future, or don't spend the time getting good advice on structures now, and seeing them pay the price later on. So poor structures set up now, either because you received bad advice from an advisor, and there is many out there, or you didn't do your research and you sort of forged ahead without proper advice, or maybe you wanted to save money now, so you set up in a certain way. If you do not review those structures and, you know, constantly evolve those structures, you can potentially have tax and compliance issues later on. And I've seen many people receive advice 10 years ago, which was great advice at the time in how to set up, but that advice just isn't relevant anymore. So when we're thinking about structures and tax efficiency, it's not I guess a once-off type exercise. It's an evolving thing also. I always tell people to be really careful with tax, I call them schemes, but tax advice or tax strategy now, entering into a type of structuring arrangement now, or at the commencement of a new business that is going to deliver tax benefits right now, potentially really big ones. that may come back and bite you later. So there's a lot of advisors out there that will peddle schemes to say, you know, come into this structure now, you're going to save this much in tax over the next 2 years, which can be great for 2 years. But what I find is that usually comes back to bite people further on down the track in some way, shape or form.
And if there's anything that the last 8 weeks have shown us is that it's a moving feast anyway. So right. There's no one who can promise you something for the next 2 years anyway, because the past doesn't dictate the future.
That's right. That's right. And look, if we all knew about what has happened in terms of stimulus measures, every sole contracting doctor would be set up as an employee of their own company and receiving $100,000 in cash boost. So, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, and we just have to do the best that we can.
Yes.
It's really important though to, when you're setting up structures, to work with somebody that's going to look at your whole situation. So you can go online and Google structures and different things, but that advice is not going to be relevant to you without consideration of your greater circumstance. So when we sit down with people and look at the appropriate structures for their business, we would be looking at the business itself. So what type of business is it? What other entities are involved? So when I say entities, I mean people, and I also mean other companies or trusts. So a lot of people have self-managed super funds, maybe investment trusts. They might have spouses that aren't working. So we have to look at the whole range of tax entities involved to work out how things are best structured. And in that, we have a look at other assets that you may own, if you have any other negative gearing benefits, if you have any losses, just, you know, what your spouse and other people in your family group's future income earning potentials are. And we also look at your long-term and short-term goals and profit goals. So there's no point setting up a structure now that's going to deal with what your business is like right now while it might be in its infancy, only for it to be really profitable later on, and that structure is just not going to serve you. Cash movements in the business. This is one that so many people don't look at when structuring. So when you set up companies and trusts, you need to not only look at how things are taxed, but how the flow of funds goes through your entities. So I've seen a lot of people end up in structures that are great for tax in the first couple of years, but they're unable to get money out and use it for other purposes just because of the distributions and the way things have been done without paying full top-up tax when they want to use that money. So it's really important to look at the way cash is flowing through. And then also, of course, trying to identify as best we can future changes and risks. As you said, it's no guarantee there, but we do the best we can to identify things that could happen. Things like, are you employing staff now? No, but in 12 months you are. So that might change the type of
business planning.
Yeah. I think we can go on to the next, Sarah. Yeah. So as Sarah went through the basic types of structures before from a legal perspective, I thought I'd do a bit of 101 tax on how different structures are taxed, because it can be confusing. So when you're a sole trader, so just you, you're taxed at your marginal tax rate because you're just lodging an individual income tax return. So you're potentially paying tax on your income up to 47% in the dollar if you're in the top tax bracket. If you're in a partnership, then you're still paying tax at your marginal rate. And whether that's with you as an individual in a partnership, or whether it's funds that have flowed through to you as an individual from another entity in partnership. But in general, the funds will still come back to you at a marginal tax rate. If you operate from a company and you're operating a business, you're most likely taxed at the 27.5% tax rate. And that's what we call a base rate entity. So if you're an investment company, then you only have passive income, interest, dividends, things like that, you wouldn't be a base rate entity. You would still be subject to the 30% tax rate. But if you're in business, generally in a small business, you'd be taxed at 27.5%. And then we have trusts. Now, trusts are not taxable entities in their own right. So the funds in trusts always flow out of the trust to beneficiaries and are taxed by beneficiaries. I shouldn't say always. The funds can be retained in the trust, but they're subject to tax at the top marginal rate if they're retained. So that's a scenario we never like to see. So the funds generally flow out to the unit holders or the beneficiaries, and then flow on from there and are taxed in the right entities. That's just income tax. There's a whole other range of taxes that do apply to entities, things like CGT and things like that. Probably a bit beyond the scope of the time that we have here. But each entity is going to have its own access to different concessions, different capital gains tax, concessions, discounts, and things like that. Now, those are sorry, we can go to the next slide now. Those are the basic entities, but what we never usually see just a basic entity, unless, as Sarah said before, you're maybe a surgeon or a GP or a dentist, and you're working under, say, a service agreement. You're starting out, great, you're a sole trader, that's fine. If you're getting into practice ownership, if you're leasing premises, if you're employing staff, you generally don't see one structure in a group. It's generally a combination of structures that are going to give you the best commercial arrangement, the best tax arrangement, and the best asset protection arrangement. So this is just an example. I'm not recommending that this is the best structure or anything like that, but I guess this is just an example to say, this is something that you would typically see as to how many entities you might have. So you might have a trading company, it leases premises, or it wouldn't own premises. You would usually lease premises. It would contract with the independent practitioners under service agreements, and it would employ the staff. And then you would have your shareholders, that they might have shares owned by their trust so that they can distribute down to other beneficiaries. You might even have another layer of entities under that. You could have a super fund off to the side if it might own a property. So as your career progresses, as you maybe move from a contractor to a practice owner or into a group practice, you tend to collect a few more entities.
And the number of entities and what they do also depends on your own appetite for risk, or you and your partner's appetite for risk, which can be as different as the number of people on this webinar. So that can be complex, but we've seen different practices dealing with the new respiratory clinics differently. So we've seen some practices who would prefer not to have that clinic in their same trading entity. So they've created new entities to keep the risk of that clinic as separate, which means then they need to do contractor agreements or services agreements with the same doctors potentially who are working in their practice to be able to work in the respiratory clinic. We've also seen other practices. We're working with a psychiatrist at the moment who's developing a lot of intellectual property as part of his practice, and so he's got a separate intellectual property entity as well. So that is a company where anything that gets developed as part of the IP of his practice automatically gets parked and protects that then in a separate legal entity from being sued as part of the practice. Yeah,
and we see that a bit too with really big practices that might have in some intangible assets. So they might have spent a lot of money on trademarks and different sorts of things, and they might want to quarantine those and license them across to the trading entity just to make sure that we're minimising risk.
They're safe.
I think the other thing to note too is there can be a point where structures can get too complex as well, for my liking. So I have a lot of clients, new clients, come to me and say, I just don't get why I have 13 entities when I'm really just well, I actually do have one real life scenario where I had a new client in the last 12 months where we shut down 8 entities.
Wow.
And it didn't really affect anything. She just kept going as from what she was doing, but she had 13 and she went down to 5. So that was a result of over many years. She had done some different things. She'd had a software sort of business she wanted to start up, which didn't really eventuate. And she had some property investments and things like that. But every time something happened, she was advised, go and set up a new entity, new trustee company. Those went dormant. They weren't cleaned up. She was paying ASIC fees. She had loans between the entities, and it was just complex.
Crazy.
So, the relief that she felt when we could shut things down and she only had a couple of things to worry about is really good. So there's a fine line and different appetites for complexity as well.
Yeah, and that also is a good that's a good reminder that if things are finished, to face it and close things down when you need to as well. Otherwise, the amount of mail she must have been getting would have been crazy. Gurdeep asks, should the companies have different directors? And I think that might be a question for a different webinar, Gurdeep. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, I did one on the different risks of owning a practice. And the first half of that is about risks as a company director and company. So that might be a good one for you to catch up on. And I think probably the answer to should the companies have different directors is it depends. And it might be one to log a call with either Kelly or myself at the end. We'll have our calendar links for you to make an appointment if you would like to. All right, let's move on. Oh, GrowthMD checklist.
Yes, so I thought I'd just put together a checklist here of the types of things that we look at when sitting down with clients and reviewing their structures. So seeing if something needs to change. So these are the sorts of, I guess, little trigger points that would trigger a sort of more complex advice or a review or even simplification of structures. So the first one, which I just said, complex structures that are expensive and confusing to administer. So that was exactly the lady's situation that I just mentioned. So if you feel like you just do not know what is going on in your structures, then it's time to talk to somebody and see if you can get some simplification, because that is just leaving the door open for things to go wrong. If you are having a planned business sale, retirement, or you just want to do some succession planning. So many business owners leave it way too late to think about structures when they want to sell or admit another owner, or even in the event of illness or something happening like that. So it's best to plan for that very, very early. So if you think you want to retire in 10 years, start thinking about it now. Because your structure may not give you access to things like small business CGT concessions and other things, or your structure might not be suitable to admit a new owner into your business. As Sarah said before, individual trustees, never really a fan of individual trustees. So that's often a review point so we can explain the risks of having an individual trustee in an entity. Business income tax at highest rates. So this isn't always going to be avoidable. If you're making lots and lots and lots of profit, chances are you may have to pay tax at the highest rates. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, because your business is probably going really, really well. But it is good if your average tax rate across all your entities is very, very high. It is good to review and just see that you are in the most tax efficient structure. Accessing losses, low income beneficiary and tax rebates. So if you are in a group or your family group has losses, if you have a spouse that maybe isn't working anymore, or if there's tax rebates that you've heard about, that's a good time to think, can we be accessing these or in a structure that does allow us to legally? My favorite, mixed trading and passive investment assets. I see this all the time. Having one entity that runs a trading business but also owns high value assets. And this sort of comes back to what you were talking about, Sarah, before, about setting up different entities. So I've seen, people have a share portfolio in the same entity that's operating a medical practice. So if the medical practice, if there's a claim against the medical practice, those shares are at risk. So that's a definite no-no, and that's something that needs to be addressed. which is similar to built up retained profits. So retained profits, profits over many years are an asset. If they're sitting, if you have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting on your balance sheet in your trading entity, it's an asset that's at risk if there's a claim against you. Joint and several liability and risk of asset security. So this comes back to what Sarah said at the start, particularly in partnerships as well. So being liable for the other people in your business. And the age of your structure. So if you have been in business for many, many years and you've never reviewed, probably time, particularly with trusts and deeds, because things change, trust law changes, and you need to update clauses. And that's something that Sarah would probably spend a lot of time doing, I can imagine.
Updating trust deeds.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed, we do. So there's another question from Ahmed. Can we talk about doctor contracts working in a clinic? Its structure is a family trust with 2 directors, so we can avoid payroll tax on doctors' income. It's been sought now by the Victorian State Revenue Office. I guess that's probably a question, Ahmed, for another webinar as well. Kelly, do you deal a lot with payroll tax in your practice?
We do. Payroll tax has been quite topical the last 12 months or so, because
particularly in New South Wales and Victoria.
Yeah, in Victoria, yeah, and particularly because of these a couple of cases and some assessments that have been raised against people bringing doctor payments into the net. It is definitely, actually I've got a webinar on this particular topic, so I can I can pass that on.
There you go.
Because it does come down to a host of factors. It's probably less about the actual structure and more about the relationship and the agreements between the doctors and the entity.
Yes.
And also, yeah, a bit of employment law and things like that in there.
Yeah, so Ahmed, I also have a webinar on my website that I've done about doctors being employees versus contractors. We don't prepare contractor agreements for doctors at all anymore. We pre-prepare services agreements. So you're welcome to find that on the webinar page of my website, which is ulegal.com.au, when we finish this one. How to influence the owners. So if you're in a practice with maybe a structure that hasn't been reviewed for a while, is how Kelly suggested. One thing I thought that might be a practical consideration for you after attending this webinar is, well, how do I talk to my fellow owners about this when there's so much going on and there's COVID and there's the day-to-day running of the business and there's employees and all the sorts of things that you have to deal with every day, not only patients, of course. So I thought I'd put together a couple of things for you to think about, and I might get Kelly to weigh in as well. But starting the conversation now, potentially for the end of financial year, there's time to get advice and change structures before next financial year starts. So thinking about that now rather than having a rush to the end of financial year deadline, I thought that was sensible. But what does Kelly say about that?
Look, it is. I think, I think any time is a good time. But there is a few things that we do like to look at before end of financial years. So if somebody was to come to us now and we were to do a review of structure, we'd be making sure that some current structure considerations and things were addressed. So they can be things like loan payouts, or if there was any share transfer that needs to be applied before the end of the year. The actual process of restructuring can be quite quick. If you need to restructure, it can be done very quickly, or it can take a really long time. And that really often depends on the parties involved and how quickly information goes back and forth. So if your advisor can give you some good advice and do that quite quickly, the turnaround time in actual share changes, any sort of rollover reliefs and things like that can be done quite quickly. I think we were chatting before, Sarah, and you mentioned that it's usually with, big groups of people, the hardest thing is getting agreement between parties and correspondence signed off and things like that. But there is definitely a window now to review your structure, and I just think the earlier the better.
Yeah, and I also have said in here, it means that if there's an issue with your existing structure, that you have thought about and agreed a way forward in the absence of high emotion, which if you're in a structure that isn't really beneficial for you and you want to leave at some stage in the future, or someone else wants to leave and you're not in the most beneficial structure, then you've really missed out on having that opportunity by not having that conversation. So then I've said, be brave, let them know that this has been keeping you up worrying and why you think it's important in your particular case. Because as I said before, it always does depend, and people have the craziest of circumstances. It's one of the most fun things about being a lawyer, I've got to say. We get to find out about people's lives in a very deep way, and really nothing surprises us anymore, I think. I don't know if you feel the same way, Kelly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, oh, here we go. We'll go to that slide because I can actually elaborate a few things. These are just a couple of examples. Actually, before I talk about these, though, I'll just tell you another one that's we don't have a slide for. I had a group, and this goes back to just being open and communicating with co-owners. Often it is the case where one owner or two owners may want to review things and be very proactive about changing things, and there might be some other owners that are just happy just to let things slide and they don't want to rock the boat and everything's fine. And I've seen that go quite badly. If you do not speak up and address structure issues, which inevitably affect the relationships within the practice, you do end up sort of sometimes having issues further on down the track. So I had quite a big specialty practice that had, it was actually a mixture of two specialties operating out of the same entity. I didn't set it up. And they had fixed dividends, or fixed ownership, and they didn't have the same costs or income levels. So some were working more, some were working less, some had much higher overheads in one of the specialties than the other. They'd taken a very expensive lease fit out. They had a lot of staff, and after not being in the right structure and getting the right, I guess, reward for their own service, left people feeling very angry. It turned into a very hostile relationship, ended up disbanding very sort of emotionally, I guess. Staff were laid off, lost a lot of money on the fit out. So all the fit out loans and everything had to be paid out. The lease, there was some loss there on the lease. So it was a big financial loss for everybody, as well as losing, I think, relationships with colleagues. Importantly, they'd prepared a shareholders agreement, but had never actually got it signed off as well. So there wasn't even a shareholders agreement to guide the dissolution. So I just think if there is a structure issue, just bring it out on the table. Because the short-term pain is better than some sort of long-term problem.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully it's not even pain, I guess. It's it's a conversation, and it's about being thoughtful about how you have it, maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
Or getting a third party in to have it with.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's amazing how often you and I probably act as intermediaries or peacekeepers and you know, bring parties together to try and reach amicable solutions.
Definitely.
So, yeah. So these are just a couple of examples of some problem structures that we've fixed recently. The first one was a very small GP clinic. It was owned in a company, had been owned for quite a number of years, but the main GP, the main principal GP, was the sole shareholder of the company. Over the years, he'd acted as a contractor, but there'd been retained profits built up, and he had extracted cash from the business, but those retained profits hadn't been paid out. So when the business came to us, he had some non-complying tax issues there. So we actually had to pay some dividends out we wanted to pay dividends out to get rid of some of these retained profits that needed to be paid out. The problem with the owner being the sole shareholder is that all the dividends had to go to him. And so he would have been taxed at the top rate of 47%. And this is actually quite a common scenario. It's sort of structuring 101, really. The income from the practice was not personal services income. He was earning that in his own name as a contractor. It was business income. So it could have been paid out to any beneficiary. So what the solution was there that we did actually establish a family trust. We had beneficiaries of that trust from the family group. One of the beneficiaries actually had some carried forward losses that we could utilise as well. So they'd just been sitting there for quite a long time and nobody had addressed them. We did some share transfers and we were able to also minimise any tax on share transfers with some CGT concessions and restructure relief to get that share transfer done tax-free. And then we could start really cleaning up the entity and all these loans and that sort of thing. That is a really simple fix, that one, which can be turned around in a couple of weeks. So that's not a long process to fix something like that. The second one was a couple of specialists in a small group. They'd been in that group for a long time. They actually had a build-up of retained profits in their company. So they were obviously making enough money that they didn't need to take it out or pay it out. It was great. They had discretionary trust shareholders, so that was a really good start. But this business actually had a mix of business assets and investment passive assets in the company. So it had a business premises actually owned in that same company that was operating a business. So there was some risk there. So we actually, in this case, inserted a holding company in between the shareholders and the trading entity, which can be done with using concessions for stamp duty and capital gains tax. And we can move the retained profits up to that middle level, still capping tax at 27.5%. We facilitated the transfer of the premises over to a unit trust, and they utilised their SMSFs to buy the units there. So that was really in line with their retirement strategy as well, to keep the premises. And we were able to utilise the small business CGT concessions to minimise tax there. So I guess these are just showing some of the restructure type events that we do deal with, and they're not always as scary as they think if we can access concessions and restructure relief.
Yeah, great. I thought I'd explain one that we have happening in relation to a large group of GPs who currently operate as a partnership. There's about 14 of them, so it's quite a lot of them, and they've got a few different clinics, but they're one entity at the moment that creates those, that runs all three practices. So they had an issue last year with one of the partners' billings, and with so many partners, I suppose it is hard to know what your fellow business partners are up to, and that was something that impacted then all of the rest of the partners from a financial perspective. They've also got probably a similar issue of payroll tax, as Ahmed mentioned earlier, and the individual doctors are in partnership together as individuals, and so they're pretty much in a very vulnerable position for their own personal assets and their own personal retirement plans, especially when it comes to their super and also their leave entitlements are all up in the air a little bit as well. So wanting to dissolve the partnership for this financial year and create a unit trust with a trustee company and put proper agreements into place with their doctors, creating that structure for flexibility for people coming in and out as new partners, and for protection of the doctors individually, and that payroll tax issue to try and minimise the risk of getting hit as well. So there's a lot being achieved out of the changes from both the tax perspective and also the risk mitigation perspective as well. So we've got a bit of time for questions now, if we do have any. We've had some along the way, which has been awesome. But what has that made you think about? What's your number one takeaway from today's webinar if you don't have a question? Love to hear from you. We were thrilled to see how many people registered. Everyone's madly typing, Kelly. What was your number one takeaway from today? Do you have a takeaway?
No, but well, myself, are you talking to me? Oh, well, I'm just pleased that we finally got to do this webinar. I think I think my takeaway that I would leave people with, not me, is just don't be scared to have an initial conversation about your structure with your advisors, because there is no harm in just saying, hey, do you think I'm in the best structure? Is there anything that I could be doing?
Trusts can be very confusing, even for lawyers and accountants. So having them explain to you multiple times, if that's what you need, there's absolutely no shame in that, because they can be very, very complex to understand because they're not part of our everyday conversation. We've got some questions now. All right. Okay. Raj says, I think our setup is okay, but need to clean up some of the obsolete structures. That's a great point of view, Raj, especially if they're still having tax returns done and you have to pay for professional fees on them as well as the ASIC fees, then that's not the best use of your money probably. And I'm sure that your advisors would prefer to be doing something more valuable for you as well. Amanda says, is it common for individuals to seek more than one opinion when creating a business structure?
Yeah, I think that has a couple of layers to it. So it would depend on your advisor. So many advisors have a really strong trust relationship with their clients if they've been working together for a number of years, and you really trust that your advisor is switched on and is going to give you the best advice. But if you have any doubt about that, or if you don't have a long-standing or a trusting relationship with your advisor, I don't think it hurts to seek second opinions. And it can be, different people do have different points of view on things, just like any industry. So different
like
advisors and lawyers will...
second opinions with doctors, and in your industry, people expect that, and they want you to be talking to other people. So it would be nice if that was the same in other professions. It's not necessarily that common, but it doesn't seem like a terrible idea. All right, what's the next one? Ahmed says for him not to get partners in a clinic, especially if they work in the clinic. That's interesting, Ahmed. It just reminded me of another client that I spoke to last week who had got partners to work in the clinic, and then they opened one around the corner, which really disappointed him, understandably. Rakesh says, will individual ABNs and structures have any issues if we're planning to IP the business?
So I think what Rakesh is saying, that you would be building up some business goodwill and having some intellectual property in your business. Is that your take, Sarah?
I was wondering if they're planning on listing it, maybe. But yes, it's probably best to have a conversation with a professional advisor about structuring, because if you are developing IP in the business, you might not want to have that in your own personal name or in a partnership of personal names. That can get messy too. All right, Deborah says, if beneficiaries are now earning elsewhere and not low income, is a family trust useful at all? The good thing about family trust, Deborah, is they're quite flexible. So if you've got grown-up children, for example, who are now earning, they might not be as beneficial for distributions as they maybe used to be when they were at uni, is my guess. But what does Kelly say about family trust? I've found it's really useful in our family, where my husband and I both run professional businesses, to have the flexibility, depending on whose business is doing well, for our accountant to be able to distribute money based on who's had a good year.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the beauty of family trust, is flexibility. They also have a good access to CGT concessions and things like that as well. Essentially, your family trust can be used for investment purposes, or it could be your trading entity, in which case it's a perfectly fine vehicle. I like to have companies in the mix somewhere if you're operating businesses practices. Because it means that you can cap your tax rate somewhere along the line at 27.5%. But family trust can still be useful. And if you were thinking of changing structures, then you would want to check the costs involved in changing as well.
Definitely, particularly if you've got a family trust that's a shareholder of another entity. Changing the shareholdings can be pretty expensive and might overcome any benefit that you might otherwise get. Gurdeep says, can my kids and parents be a trustee in the family trust? Now, the question for me is if you actually mean trustee or if you mean beneficiary. You could have those individuals as the trustee of the trust, but as Kelly and I have said, we do prefer companies to be the trustee. They can also potentially be beneficiaries of a family trust, and it might be that they already are in the wording of the trust. Kids who are over 18 can be distributed to, but when they're under 18, that they're not eligible. Your parents may well be eligible if their earnings are down, and I've got a client that does distribute to their parents, and they pay them to do that. They then pay to do all their tax returns as well, so that they're getting a benefit of being a beneficiary of the trust. Ahmed says, that's what I'm always convinced of. Sorry, Ahmed, I've lost the conversation there, but I think it's in relation to having partners who work in the clinic. Kim says, if the shareholder of the trading entity company is a family trust that has a loan, the medical centre building, and that there is retained profit in the company, how can we pay off the loan with minimum tax consequence? Now, that might be a call with Kelly, I think, to answer that, so that she can more deeply understand that structure. So I'll pop, here we go. Why don't I do that now? That is a link to book a meeting with Kelly. Kim, I suggest you do that. There's no cost for doing that. She's happy to chat to anyone who's made the time to come on this webinar. We know that your time is often the most valuable thing to you, and we thank you very much for being with us. So Kim, there's the link to do that. Rakesh did mean listing. So they want to list the medical centre. That was something that I would highly recommend you get personal advice on, and do not do in your own names. You should speak to someone who has experience with creating listed entities. We've done it with clients, so I'm happy to talk you through it. Yes, don't create IP in your own name. And if you do, there are things we can do about that. We can create an assignment of IP document that then puts that through into the entity that's going to be listing. But if you start off fresh, as Kelly's been saying all along, then it can be cheaper in the long run, and it's also smoother for people. Gurdeep says, after what age can the kids be trustees? The answer is when they're adults. Kim, can we add more companies as a beneficiary of the family trust? I think Kim's talking about a dump company.
A bucket company. Yeah, look, you can have companies, you can have as many companies as you want. The problem is the more companies that you add, the more complexity you add, the more accounting fees you have. And some advisors actually peddle having different companies as beneficiaries as a tax strategy. There is some big issues with having distributions from family trusts to companies that are not paid out
Mm-hmm.
And they're essentially loans, which can't fall under a special section of the tax legislation called Division 7A, and you actually charge you interest.
Yes.
And if you don't put them under loan agreements, there's other consequences there. So before you start opening up more companies, it's good to get particular advice and just check that that's actually what you want to do.
Yes, it's a very good idea to get advice. The reality with tax is they're going to get it from you somehow. You can put it off in the 7A loan, you kind of just delay the paying of the tax, and you're paying interest as well. So there's always costs and risks of the choices. It's just good to be aware of what they are. Ahmed says, does the state revenue office collect a massive amount on doctors' payroll tax from a clinic owner, although we owners did not know about it and our accountant never mentioned it? I guess, Ahmed, that might be a conversation to have with your existing accountants about that risk that you might have expected to be advised of when they helped you structure. So yes, I don't know that we can go into that much more here. I've popped the link for booking in with me. If you would like to have a chat about anything, feel free to just reply to the emails that I've been sending as well, and I can send you a link to book into my calendar. If that's easier for you, sometimes it can be. I've been sending you a few emails to remind you about the webinar. All right, that's the end of our questions. I also, and it's perfectly on time, I run a Facebook group called You Legal for Doctors. You're invited to join it. Keep the conversation going. There's other webinars in there that are easy to access, and you can ask any questions in there too. There's other people who can help answer and are very experienced entrepreneurial doctors. So you're welcome to join the Facebook group. Kelly, any parting words from you?
No, I just think what I said before, just run through that checklist that I put up before. If Sarah, if you're sending a copy of the webinar,
you'll send the PDF copy.
PDF, Yep. Freeze that slide and run through that checklist and just see if that triggers anything for you, and then reach out to myself, Sarah, or your existing advisor and make sure you get some good advice.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Go deep. Look forward to our chat. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming along. It's been a great webinar.
Thanks, Sarah.
See you guys soon.